Hello there, welcome to Planet America's Fireside Chat. I'm John Barron.
And I'm Licciardello.
This week, as Jimmy Carter celebrates his 100th birthday, we'll take stock of America's 39th president with his former speechwriter, James Fallows.
And we're going to look at the Senate races that might decide what America's next president can get done.
Spoiler alert, probably not much. But first, we talked on Wednesday night's Planet America about the vice presidential debate and the moments that we thought might make it quickly into campaign attack ads. Nothing officially from Trump yet, although there are plenty of swipes at Tim Walz on social media about him being a knucklehead. There was this, though, from the Harris campaign.
It's really rich for Democratic leaders to say that Donald Trump is a unique threat to democracy when he peacefully gave over power.
He is still saying he didn't lose the election. I would just ask that. Did he lose the 2020 election?
Tim, I'm focused on the future.
That is a damning non-answer. America, I think you've got a really clear choice of who's going to honor that democracy and who's going to honor Donald Trump.
And that was probably Tim Walz's best moment of the debate, J.D. Vance's worst moment of the debate, and it came pretty much at the very end of the debate too.
Pretty much, and I think it's not a coincidence that the worst moments for J.D. Vance were when he was trying to defend the indefensible from Trump. And when he could freelance a bit, he was doing just fine. And I can't help thinking that might not be a coincidence, and that what was happening then when J.D. Vance has been so pleasant and sociable and lovely, I don't think that debate had any impact on the race.
Yeah.
But I think it had a big impact on J.D. Vance's favourable numbers. And I can't help thinking that might have been the beginning of J.D. Vance's campaign for the 2028 primary.
Yeah, he certainly did not look like the weird J.D. Vance, the childless cat ladies J.D. Vance of social media fame, or indeed of his Fox News and other appearances. Although I do note the favourability ratings for J.D. have not improved. He's still at 38% in a YouGov poll today. But I think you're right. The perception will be, actually, this guy is kind of normal. This guy I could see as a Republican presidential candidate in his own right in 4 years from now.
Yeah, and I can't help noticing that he didn't say any of the things that Trump might have wanted him to say. Like, for instance, he didn't back Trump up on the stolen election at all. He didn't go near that. He came up with this weird excuse about, the real politicization is Facebook and censorship.
Yeah.
And he just wouldn't give Trump what he wanted, because I think, once again, he's looking after himself going forward, which, I'm not sure Trump would have loved that, but it's great for J.D. Vance.
Yeah, and it was probably the only time in the debate where J.D.'s debating skill to immediately pivot into a non-answer into what he wanted to talk about looked clunky and wasn't at all convincing. But because of that moment in the debate, and a lot of the focus group said that was one of the more memorable moments and ones that concerned them about Trump and Vance. Right on cue, the January 6th case was then thrust well and truly back into the spotlight yesterday when the Washington DC judge overseeing Special Counsel Jack Smith's charges against Trump, Tanya Chutkan, released Smith's latest brief of evidence. And this is the one where he argues why this case against Trump should still go ahead despite the June Supreme Court ruling granting sweeping presidential immunity for what are deemed official acts. This is a 165-page brief. It provides some previously unseen evidence of Trump's alleged criminality after losing the 2020 election and his efforts to overturn the result, including the attack on the Capitol building itself on January the 6th. Smith, though, has set aside what he believes constitute official acts of a president in that period, and he's highlighting now what he sees as just the actions of Donald Trump, the candidate for office, a private person pursuing their personal interests in retaining power. Now, former President Trump, meanwhile, says that the unsealing of this filing now in the last 4 or 5 weeks of the presidential campaign does in itself represent election interference.
They should have never allowed the information to come before the public, but they did that because they want to hurt you with the election. Now, so far, and we've had great victories, but so far, what has happened is if you take a look at what they've done, the public doesn't buy it, and my poll numbers have gone up instead of down. It's pure election interference to get an incompetent person like Kamala. She's grossly incompetent. She's more incompetent than Biden to get these people elected. And the voters, they get it. They've read it, they get it. And it's already come out. Every single channel is calling it election interference. Ready? They rigged the election. The election was rigged. I didn't rig it, they did.
Now, wading through this 165 pages, as I was yesterday, Chaz, I felt that we knew most of this stuff.
Yep.
It's stuff that came out in the indictments themselves or came out in the last couple of years in the January 6th Congressional Committee hearings. A couple of new things I think are worth mentioning that may have an impact. One is Mike Pence gave evidence, and we saw some of that evidence, the conversations he had with Donald Trump, essentially trying to cajole Trump into conceding defeat in November and December of 2020. Pence essentially saying, don't worry, we can run again in 4 years. Come on, buddy. Let's just, say, OK, fair cop, we've lost this one. And that's where you get the sense of, and the Trump that comes through in the witness evidence, you kind of think, how could anybody vote for this person to be president again? I mean, he is behaving like a toddler. And yet, at the same time, he is acknowledging he knows he lost. And yet he's saying publicly that he won, and he's inciting people to violence in his name because he says that it was stolen from him. Probably the most memorable thing, though, is where Trump is alone in the dining room off the Oval Office. He's watching all this unfold on Fox News on January 6th. An aide comes to him and says, Mike Pence is being rushed to the basement of the Capitol because the protesters have breached the Capitol. He's in danger, chanting, hang Mike Pence. Trump says, so what? Ooh. Trump says, so what in that moment. Now, that is pretty damning stuff. Mike Pence also contributed a lot more. It's interesting stuff. I'm not sure it's a game changer. The question is, though, is it enough of a reminder to people? Could this knock a little bit of paint off Trump in this final stretch?
I mean, potentially a month is a long time in an election campaign. There's going to be 4 more of these stories maybe 10 more of these stories before the election. So whether this is still front of mind in a month's time, I don't know. January 6th was a huge issue in the 2022 election, and I can see why the Democrats would be keen to make it an issue again in the 2024 election. Although I suspect abortion is going to be the issue that keeps on delivering for them all the way to the election. I suppose just on Trump's point about the election interference thing, it's a bit rich. From the beginning, all the legal stuff with Trump, both sides have been clearly cognizant of the election and playing for the election. And Trump has strategically leaked all kinds of stuff from his court cases for PR reasons as well. I mean, there's no doubt that Jack Smith has released this with the election in mind. He specifically petitioned the court to go first before the defence, when the defence are meant to go first. Obviously knowing the defence would take until after the election, and was trying to get this out before the election. So I understand why people would be annoyed by that, but I feel like these are the rules that both sides have been playing the whole time.
And it's also a case of careful what you wish for in terms of Conservatives and the Supreme Court majority that said that Trump enjoys sweeping presidential immunity, because it then put the onus on Smith to say, what are the things that should not be immune? Here's all the bad stuff. So he's been compelled to bring this out so the case goes forward. It does feel as though the case will go forward if Kamala Harris is elected. There's a lot in there. But of course, if Trump is elected, this whole case goes away very, very quickly.
Nothing surer than that.
Yeah, for sure. America's 39th President, Jimmy Carter, is celebrating his 100th birthday this week. It is the first time that a former president has ever reached that milestone. Jimmy Carter, a former peanut farmer and Democratic governor of the state of Georgia, was elected president in 1976 in the immediate aftermath of Watergate and the war in Vietnam.
And if I can tap the greatness that's in you and in the American people, we can make our nation's government great and a source of pride once again.
Being a Washington outsider helped Jimmy Carter win the presidency, but it did not help him to govern. He struggled to work with his fellow Democrats in Congress, beset by high inflation and oil and energy crisis, and what Carter called a crisis of confidence, all weighing down his administration and the nation.
We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation.
High points of Carter's presidency included the signing of the Camp David peace accords between Israel and Egypt, but there are a lot more low points, including the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Iranian Revolution, the capture of American hostages at the US Embassy in Tehran, and a failed rescue attempt. Jimmy Carter lost his re-election bid to Ronald Reagan in 1980 after fending off a challenge for the Democratic nomination by more liberal Democratic Senator Ted Kennedy. But Carter did go on to have a more successful post-presidency as a peace negotiator, election monitor and human rights advocate, winning Jimmy Carter the Nobel Peace Prize in 2002. When he was at home in Plains, Georgia, he taught Sunday school well into his 90s. He helped to build houses for the poor, and a long life of service ultimately was not defined by that one political defeat. Jimmy Carter recently said that he'd like to live long enough to vote for Kamala Harris. Well, early voting in Georgia opens on October the 15th. For more, we're joined by author and journalist James Fallows, who worked on Jimmy Carter's 1976 presidential campaign and then on White House staff as Carter's chief speechwriter. Jim Fallows, welcome back to Planet America's Fireside Chat.
John, thanks. It's great to be with you again.
Jim, can you start by explaining to us a little bit about who Jimmy Carter was as a person and a candidate and a president? Who was this man you came to know so well?
So I think something I've written in more and less barbed ways over the decades is that he was an easier person to admire than to work for, which may be true of many people who are great men and great women, in that he could come across in small settings as being the most empathetic person you could imagine. And that empathy didn't always extend to the staff. The same could be true of Bill Clinton and some others too. But I think that we saw in Jimmy Carter's rise and then some of his struggles in office, the fact that there are these contradictory skills that go into getting to be president and then being president. One of the skills is to being able to work very much at the retail level to deal with individual voters in Iowa and New Hampshire and all these primary states, and individual politicians when you're lobbying with the Congress. But then you have this wholesale style politicking you need to do in big speeches and to people you're never going to meet yourself. And Jimmy Carter was much better at that retail work. Again, nobody would believe it now, but in a crowd of 250 people extemporaneously in a union hall or a farmer's hall or whatever, he was really great. He was as good as Obama or Bill Clinton or anybody you'd think of in that kind of setting. It's a different kind of audience to talk to State of the Union addresses or UN addresses, and that was more of a struggle for him. He was president at an impossible time in American history, but I think the magic that made him president also didn't really equip him to be as successful in those 4 years in office.
Now, Jim, another feature of Carter's presidency is that he fought with his own party more than he fought with the other side. Is that also part of his legacy, that to this day, co-partisans have decided to never take that risk again?
A recurring theme here is kids these days, it's impossible to imagine what life was like then. And one of the things that's impossible to imagine is the Democrats had in the House of Representatives a majority, their margin was more than 150 seats. That since the time of FDR, essentially they'd had an almost permanent lock on the House of Representatives, and they had, I think, a veto-proof, 2/3 majority in the Senate. And so the only fights that seemed worth picking were within the Democratic Party, because that's essentially where all the action was. So I think that Carter was part of a movement within the party that reached its electoral success probably with Bill Clinton, of saying that we'd had this long run from Franklin Roosevelt through Lyndon Johnson of being able to do things one way. And now the demographics of American politics were changing, that the economics of American budgeting were changing, and we needed to switch into a different way. And Carter was that transitional figure. He was a transition just in himself. Again, a Baptist, white, Southern farmer who, as the white governor of Georgia, was the one who hung a portrait of Martin Luther King Jr. in the Georgia State Capitol and was endorsed by Martin Luther King Sr. when he was running for president. So he kind of embodied all this Walt Whitman-like containing multitudes, but he was there as the figure when the party was beginning to transform itself. And so the fights he had in his own party did prefigure the kind of convulsions and evolutions the party would go through, and going from Clinton then to Obama and now to Biden.
So, Jim, you left the Carter White House before the end of his presidency. You went back to journalism and you wrote quite a famous critique of Carter for the Atlantic Monthly, where you described his presidency as a passionless presidency. You essentially said that he is a good man who did not become a good president because he did not care to learn what it took to be a good president. Can you give us an example of that kind of thing that you mean when you said he was a passionless president?
I think everybody who works in journalism and political journalism should work in politics one time. One time because you learn things that way you can't learn otherwise. One term and not 2 times or 10 times because it's a sort of standalone immersion and you're not going to go back and forth anymore. And one of the things I learned in those couple of years I spent in the White House is how impossible the job of being president is, because the only choices you get to make are the ones where there's no good answer. Every other choice somebody else has made, and the assistant secretary of labor or some ambassador to Kosovo or whatever, they make those choices. The only ones you get are the ones that are lose, lose, lose. And Jimmy Carter was so proud / prideful about his own intelligence that he was sort of too much hands-on managing everything and not recognizing that the key to being a successful president is having a team. We know about Abraham Lincoln's team of rivals and FDR having all the New Deal cohort. Carter had very few friends of his own generation. Most people who worked for him were the age of his children. Jimmy Carter was exactly the same age as my late father, who did not survive to age 100 as Jimmy Carter has. And he was a little bit too much involved in studying the thrust to weight charts for the B-1 bomber, or doing sort of nitpick editing in speeches that he didn't really need to do. The good side of this is one of his most lasting achievements, which was the Camp David peace accords between Egypt and Israel. The one peace agreement that has lasted, and that is something that Jimmy Carter himself crafted just through hours and hours of in-person negotiating with Begin and Sadat, saying, okay, we're going to draw the line here. We're going to have the settlements there, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, he was too much involved in the engineering and plumbing of the presidency and not as much in the big picture, you could say, Reagan-esque, making other people go the way you wanted them to go.
Now, you said that Carter was president at a tough time. Is it your view that no one could have gotten through that period of history unscathed as president?
Yes. And I think I had a line in something I wrote about Carter recently, noting this birthday, saying that only a country as impossible to govern as the U.S. was in the late 1970s could have taken a risk on somebody like Jimmy Carter, because it was a real sort of cri de coeur from the American electorate in 1976 of, after Vietnam, again, barely out of Vietnam, the fall of Saigon happened while Carter was campaigning in 75, with the first time that the, quote, energy shock was beginning to happen. Gasoline went from being something like 40 cents a gallon in the U.S. In the early 1970s to 5 times that, et cetera. It was there was unemployment on a really large scale. If you think of the movies of the 1970s, like Taxi Driver or Deer Hunter, they are not kind of feel-good movies. And so it was the kind of convulsion that in some ways led to Donald Trump 8 years ago, but with a much more sort of encouraging outcome this time, where Carter was saying, in a line that could be taken as sarcastic, but he didn't mean it sarcastically. He said he promised them a government as good as the people, as good as the American people. Maybe that's what we've had we've always had by definition a government as good as the American people, but Carter meant that in an uplifting way. And if you think of the things that were happening then, the tensions within the Democratic Party after just the chaos and bloodshed, literally, of the Vietnam War and all the race riots of the 1960s, the Republican Party beginning its transformation to be the party of the white South, of the rise of Japan in particular as a manufacturing power, and the end of that sort of taken for granted prosperity of post-World War II America for 2 decades or so. The shift of Americans' place in the world, it just was a really difficult time. And Carter had all that. He said, I want to sort of be the vessel for a troubled country, and he got that. He got all the troubles of America right on his lap. And of course, the revolution in Iran and all these other things. So it was a really hard time. He did a lot of things. He did more things that will last than were generally recognized at the time. But it was a bad time for the country and for him.
So, Jim, after you left Carter's White House, you wrote that very critical piece that we talked about in 1979. Following year, Carter loses re-election to Ronald Reagan. Were you persona non grata after that in sort of Carter world, or did you manage to reconnect?
So I've reconnected with him many times after that. I think among people who had worked for him, there was a sort of widespread acknowledgement that, what I was writing about, they had seen as well. And so many of my remaining closest friends are people whom I knew in that time. I think Carter, my impression is that anybody who had ever been for him, he regarded with charity. He had undergone a lot. I think the person he had the hardest time forgiving until the very end was Senator Teddy Kennedy, because that was a very bitter feud. So I've been part of Carter gatherings many, many times. We were all in a long ago difficult battlefield, and we're on the same side at one time and recognize the virtue of the things he stood for and the things we all were trying to achieve.
Finally, Jim, which quality of Jimmy Carter's do we need most in 2024?
How about honesty? Honesty and I'll just come back to honesty. I mean, he was so honest that he sold his peanut farm so he wouldn't be accused of any kind of conflict of interest in, agricultural price supports. This is something that probably would have made a few $1,000s difference to him in the course of of his term. So I would go with honesty and directness and a spiritualism in this sense. Jimmy Carter was actually spiritual. I think he believed in UFOs. He probably there may have been some spiritualist sessions that he went to both before and after being president, but a belief in interests and causes bigger than yourself also would take us a long way.
James Fallows, always such a great pleasure. Thank you for having a fireside chat with us.
My pleasure. Thank you. Greetings to all in Australia.
Now to America's fastest growing form of education, homeschooling. Melina Wicks explains why the largely unregulated practice is no longer confined to the fringe.
If movies have taught me anything, it's that American schools are places of ruthless hierarchies, hilarious antics, and students in their 30s. But the nature of school in America is changing. Public school enrollment dropped by 1.2 million kids from 2020 to 2022. Some of them went to private schools. Some dropped out of school entirely. But these days, the fastest growing part of the US education system is homeschooling.
Between 2017 and 2023, homeschooling went up more than 50% in almost half of the states with available data.
That's a huge increase. So how many kids today are being homeschooled in the US? I don't know. No one does. In 11 states, you don't even have to tell anyone that you're homeschooling your kids. But that's not what Ron DeSantis is worried about.
The kids are in many ways an open book. And do you want to turn them over for 8 hours a day to some indoctrination factory?
Absolutely not. Only homemade indoctrination for my kids. Homeschooling has typically been seen as a conservative Christian movement, but the recent increase has been fueled by a much more diverse group. A Washington Post survey found homeschoolers today are motivated by things like fear of school shootings, anxiety over bullying, and anger with politics in schools. And nearly 3 in 10 of the families surveyed had kids with ADHD, about twice the rate of families who don't homeschool. For kids struggling in public schools, homeschooling is an increasingly well-resourced and achievable alternative. So do homeschool kids do better?
It's been proven that homeschoolers do better on standardized tests and, once in college, stay enrolled longer and perform stronger overall.
It has not been proven. There's very little evidence for or against homeschooling. 2 large studies supporting homeschooling used volunteers who were far whiter, more religious, more married, better educated, and wealthier than national averages. The kind of kids who tend to do well wherever they go to school. In reality, there are no studies of academic achievement that draw from a representative nationwide sample of homeschoolers. And only 9 states require all homeschooled students to have their academic performance assessed. The surge in homeschooling across the US is an experiment, and no one's checking the results. But one group that's definitely losing is public schools.
With public school revenue tied directly to attendance, fewer students means fewer dollars.
If a kid leaves public school, their funding goes with them, even though the fixed costs of the school stay the same. We don't know if the increase in homeschooling is going to be better or worse for kids overall. But there's one thing we do know homeschooling has over public schools. It's the only classroom where you won't die of embarrassment when you accidentally call the teacher mum.
Now, as we all know, the Democrats hold 51 seats in the Senate. They have a current majority, but they are about to lose West Virginia. We all agree on that, yes?
Joe Manchin, Democrat, retiring, and Republicans going to win it by 20 points.
Absolutely. That means 50-50 Senate. Now, if Trump wins the presidency, there is, I think, pretty much no doubt that he'll either have 50 seats or more of the Senate. But if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, not necessarily. She could be on 50 seats if she's lucky, or she might have less, in which case she loses the Senate. And John, can you tell the viewers why that matters?
Well, if you have 50 seats in the Senate, if you're the party who has the White House, then the Vice President is the President of the Senate. They become the tie-breaking vote. So there are times when Kamala Harris broke ties in Joe Biden's Senate, for example. So it can be really, really important because you need that majority just to get certain things to the floor, even if you've then got to overcome a filibuster, even to just debate something. You often need that 51 votes. It also means, of course, confirmations. So if you don't have a Senate majority, then you can have difficulty getting people on the court, even people into the administration. It can also affect the direction of policy. So when George H.W. Bush was the last president whose political party did not have a Senate majority in 1989, Bush had to make some big changes, big sacrifices. He increased taxes after saying that he would not increase taxes because Democrats had the numbers in Congress to do it, and he wasn't going to veto it because, well, America had a big deficit at the time, and he wanted to do something about that. So he had to compromise, and it cost him politically, and that was all because he didn't have the numbers in the Senate.
And you especially need 50 seats to confirm judges, which is always a big issue. Now, until now, Montana has been that 50th seat that they've been hanging in for. Ain't looking good at the moment. Montana is, the Democrats are now down by 4 points in Montana, and that gap is growing.
And John Tester there has always been one of these rare Democrats who is able to keep winning in a increasingly Republican state.
Yep.
He's well known, but he's also kind of lucky in terms of his timing. He was re-elected in years that were good for Democrats.
Yeah. There is the competitor against the Democrats is a Republican. His name's Tim Shea. He's he's a veteran, and Tester was looking okay against him a little while back because, in particular, there was a bit of a controversy that Tim Shea was claiming to be wounded in Afghanistan. Now, he had some valor issues there, but it turned out that he also told a service ranger in 2015 that the bullet wound in his arm came from him accidentally shooting himself in Glacier National Park. So that's not the best. But having said that, he's still kind of taking John Tester out.
Right.
So Montana seems to be the end of the Democrats' hopes, except
what?
There are 3 more states that are becoming more likely. In particular, Texas and Florida are both becoming good at the same time for the Democrats. Both states are now within about 3 points for the Democrats, and they're becoming closer. Let's start with Texas in particular, because they've been spending a lot of money in Texas. Florida, they've barely started spending money because they kind of gave up on that before they even began. But in Texas, you've got Ted Cruz, who's not a popular man. His favourability at the moment is 41 to unfavourables of 49. He's underwater by 8 points. And if you think he's not struggling, just listen to him begging for money on conservative television.
Chuck Schumer has been explicit. I'm his #1 target in the country. And the Democrats are spending over $100 million. Chuck Schumer and George Soros are flooding cash into the state of Texas. There have been multiple polls in the last 3 weeks that show it as a 4-point race, a 3-point race, a 2-point race, and there have been 2 polls that show it as a 1-point race. They are coming after me with everything they got. My opponent, who is an extreme left-wing Democrat, is a congressman named Colin Allred. He's voted with Nancy Pelosi 100% of the time his first 4 years in Congress. He's voted for open borders and higher taxes and defunding the police. And yet he's been on TV for 3 months straight with relentless attack ads. I just went on TV a couple of weeks ago. And so I want to encourage your viewers this morning. I need your help. Please go to tedcruz.org, tedcruz.org, and contribute, because we are getting swamped.
He's sweating.
He's begging.
There was a Morning Consult poll where he is actually behind by 1 point. Thing is, this has happened before. Beto O'Rourke did exactly the same thing to Ted Cruz 6 years ago. Yeah, exactly. So maybe Florida's the one. But Florida and Texas, both of them cost about $100 million each to run in.
Right.
And that's a lot of money in the last few weeks. They're going to have to pick one of them. Yeah. Unless there's a third option, which is Nebraska. You go, hang on, Nebraska? Really? Not the Democrats. There's an independent, Dan Osborne, who originally was running as a Democrat, but then he chose, no, I'm not going to be a Democrat. He refused their nomination.
Would he caucus with Democrats if he's elected, sort of Bernie Sanders style?
He's not saying. But I think we know that he probably would. Certainly the Democrats seem to think he would. And he's an ex-union boss. He led a strike. Unions are very popular these days. Anyway, this is how he presents himself as a ferocious independent.
The U.S. Senate is a bunch of millionaires controlled by billionaires. My opponent, Deb Fischer, is part of the problem. She's taken so much corporate cash, she should wear patches, like NASCAR. She's gotten 10 times richer in the Senate. She hasn't held a public town hall since 2017. She promised to cut the deficit. She lied. She signed a 2-term pledge, lied about term limits too. Deb lies. We just get stuck with the bill. Thanks, Deb. More of our money wasted. I'm Dan Osborne, an industrial mechanic who's actually worked for a living.
And he's running on the, not Democrat line, the legalised marijuana now line.
Yeah, and it goes, sure, you don't need deep fakes, you just need somebody in a wig to be your opponent if shot from the back.
That's right. So these are the 3 contenders. But the only question is, are the Democrats maybe going to lose 2 more seats, not just 1 more seat? Because there's also Ohio.
Plot twist.
Where Sherrod Brown is still ahead by 3 points, but that is closing up. It is actually the most expensive congressional race in history. That was 2 weeks ago, so it's even more expensive now. And there's an interesting little twist here as well in Ohio, which is Sherrod Brown is not a friend of the crypto industry. Bernie Moreno, the Republican there, is a real friend of the crypto industry. And it just so happens that the crypto guys have got some deep pockets and they are spending it big time in Ohio, $39 million so far and counting. And their ads, well, they mention pretty much everything except for crypto.
The stakes couldn't be higher in the Ohio Senate race. Will we continue to choose rampant inflation and open borders? Or will Ohio elect Bernie Moreno? Your Senate vote will dictate our future. Bernie Moreno will back the Trump economic agenda, finally driving gas and grocery bills down. And Moreno will stop the flood of illegal immigrants. Save Ohio. Vote Bernie Moreno.
And don't regulate crypto. They forgot to mention that. Look, we've got a lot of states. There's a lot of complications. There's a lot of factors here. Why don't we talk to someone who actually knows what they're talking about?
Yeah, let's do that. Joining us is Jessica Taylor. She's the Senate and Governor's editor with the Cook Political Report. Jessica, welcome to the Fireside Chat.
Thanks for having me.
I wonder, Jessica, can you start by explaining to us how it is that in the same election, we're looking at an almost certain Republican majority in the Senate, whereas Democrats are likely to win the House of Representatives, and at the moment the Democrats are a little bit in front in the race for the White House as well, but the Senate seems to be going Republican.
Well, the House of Representatives with 435 members is elected every 2 years. So every election cycle it is up. Versus senators, which are 102 from every state, they are elected for 6-year terms. So basically every election cycle, a third of the Senate is up. And it matters which third of the Senate is before voters. And Democrats are defending far more seats this cycle than Republicans, 23 seats to just 11 for Republicans. And many of those come in either very red territory that Democrats currently hold in states like West Virginia, Montana, and Ohio, or in states that overlap with presidential battlegrounds like Arizona, Nevada, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin. So we have a map that is just very difficult for Democrats. They currently have a 51-49 majority. And so they can only afford to lose one seat and keep the majority. Well, they can really afford that would be if Vice President Harris wins, then that would be a 50-50 Senate and it would be a tie. They're going to lose a seat in West Virginia. They've already basically ceded that with the incumbent Democrat not running for re-election again. So they cannot lose any seats and they have to defend every incumbent. And you would then have to have a Vice President Tim Walz breaking the tie.
Now, until recently, that last Senate seat that the Democrats were doggedly trying to hold on to was Montana. But is it time to maybe give up on Montana because there are other seats that the Democrats are more likely to win?
I think Montana is just moving out of their grasp. We shifted our rating in this race from toss-up, meaning that we see both one party or the other having an even chance to win, to lean Republican, meaning that the Democrat there, John Tester, is the underdog against his Republican opponent, Tim Sheehy. Now, John Tester has won in very favorable Democratic years in the past. 2006 was the midterm elections, which was a backlash to President George W. Bush and the Iraq War. 2012 was when President Obama was reelected, and 2018 was another midterm year that was a backlash to President Trump. So he's facing headwinds this cycle in a state that President Trump carried by 16 points in 2020 and is likely to win by even more. We just see a decrease in ticket splitting in those Senate races. So because of that, we see Republicans incredibly favored to win the Senate. So that means that they need to put another seat into play. And I think the most likely seat is Texas, and then possibly after that, Florida or Nebraska.
Jessica, Democrats haven't consistently won statewide in Texas since the 1980s. There are hopes that that could change this year, and they could pick up a Senate seat there from Ted Cruz. Is that really in the realms of possibility right now, do you think?
We've seen a lot of new voters move into Texas, especially after the pandemic, and a lot of those are are younger voters, and they are more diverse voters. So they're not white voters. You know, Republicans have made some headway with Latino voters in the state, but a lot of these newer voters could be more predispositioned to vote for Democrats. And this is a state that it's gotten tighter over the past few election cycles. President Trump only carried it by about 6 points in 2020, and that was down from his margin in 2016. And so you have also a very unique incumbent there in Republican Senator Ted Cruz. He ran for president in 2016. He's also sort of been assailed, and this is a state he's never had to run after Roe v. Wade was overturned with the Dobbs decision. So Texas has a very stringent abortion law that's a heartbeat bill there. And then he also was assailed for taking a trip amidst a very bad winter storm that left much of the state without power. He took a family vacation to Cancun. He was really hit for that. And so those two things have Democrats hoping that they could put this seat more in play. We shifted our rating in this race from likely Republican to lean Republican, meaning that we do see it as more competitive. And Democrats have a very strong challenger there in Congressman Colin Allred. He's been raising a lot of money. He's a former NFL football player, played in college there in Texas. And so they do hope that they can put this seat more in play. And again, if they lose Montana, then they need to put that, and they need to find another seat to still have a majority.
Jessica, is it possible for the Democrats to fight properly in both Florida and Texas? Or are those states so big and expensive to run in that realistically the Democrats have to choose between them?
I think realistically, Democrats have to choose between them. And I think Texas, just given how much Allred is raising, and just he's raising a lot because Cruz is sort of a very polarizing figure. So that the candidate money goes further in these races than if super PACs and outside groups go in. Their ad buys can be sometimes as much as 25 times right now as we get closer to the election what the candidate rate would pay. So I think because of that, because Allred has more money, he's outspent Cruz so far. Now Cruz is on pace to spend more in the final weeks, but if more Democratic money comes in, I think that makes Texas a better play. Florida, meanwhile, it was sort of, at one point, the quintessential swing state here in America that decided the 2000 election. But it was also the only state from 2016 to 2020 where Trump increased his margin. So I think this is just increasingly a more difficult state. You have another somewhat unpopular incumbent there in Rick Scott. His Democratic opponent, a former congresswoman named Debbie Mukersel-Powell, has not raised as much money. And also, Rick Scott is a multimillionaire. He was a healthcare executive of several major hospital chains before he was elected governor and then elected to the Senate. So he has the ability to write himself a check. So I think many of those factors just make Texas a more intriguing play.
And Jessica, another battleground state, of course, is that of North Carolina, hotly contested between Harris and Trump. We know the gubernatorial race there has gotten very complicated with the sex scandal around Republican Lieutenant Governor Mark Robinson. And now, of course, we have a major natural disaster with the terrible flooding, dozens and dozens of deaths in the wake of Hurricane Helene. What is your reading of how all of those things could play into that potentially quite crucial state come November?
I think we just don't know yet. The western part of the state was really hard hit. I actually grew up near there, and some of these very rural communities have just been devastated with a lot of their infrastructure, bridges and roads knocked out, cell phone service, water, electricity in many places. I think that absentee ballots are going out, what access they have to those. Voter ID law is going into effect as well if people have lost their licenses. Now, a lot of the more rural areas are very heavily Republican, but there have been some, sort of major urban population centers like Asheville that have also been hard hit. That's sort of a liberal bastion. So I think it's too early to tell at this point, but it's certainly something, we're watching here as the region certainly tries to rebuild.
Now, we've been talking about states that Democrats could win because the Senate control could depend upon it. But what would you say is the surprise state that Republicans could most likely pinch off the Democrats? And what would be the chances of that happening, do you think?
I would keep an eye on Maryland, actually. That is a state that Biden won by 33 points, but Republicans got the former Republican governor Larry Hogan to run. This is another sort of test of ticket splitting. We don't see a lot of ticket splitting happening in Senate races, but governor's races are the one place where voters do differentiate. There's no prize for electing the most governors in the country versus if you're running for Senate, who controls the Senate matters. Hogan has won, left office very popular, was overwhelmingly reelected despite Maryland being a very Democratic state. So he's running against his Democratic opponent is Angela Also Brooks, who is Black woman. I think she's helped certainly by Harris atop the ticket. She would be only the third woman elected to, a Black woman elected to the Senate. And again, Hogan has a lot of money pouring in behind him to sort of help him try to pull off this upset. So, if voters are less concerned about party control, if they're voting for the person, this is one to watch. I think it's still a hard state, but that is one that would surprise me on election night.
Jessica Taylor from the Cook Political Report, thank you very much indeed for having a fireside chat.
Thank you.
In the run-up to next month's presidential election, we're going to be hearing a lot about the Electoral College. So, what is it? And how does it work? Most Americans think when they turn out to vote, they'll be marking a box or pulling a lever for Kamala Harris, Donald Trump, or one of the third-party candidates. But, in fact, they're voting for electors to the Electoral College, who will in turn vote for President and Vice President. There are 538 members of the Electoral College, the same number as members of Congress, the House and Senate combined. And those electors are allocated to the states on the same basis.
This stuff is so complicated.
Come on, you can do this. For example, Virginia, like all states, gets 2 senators.
2 senators?
And then based on their population size, they have 11 members of the House of Representatives. Added together, that makes...
13.
That's right. 13 in both their congressional delegation and, separately, 13 electors to the Electoral College.
Okay, maybe it's not so hard after all.
Most states allocate their Electoral College votes to the candidate who wins the most votes in that state. Nebraska and Maine are the only exceptions. They can split their slate of electors with one electoral vote for the winner in each congressional district and 2 more for the overall statewide winner.
Cup of tea, Joe? 2 sugars, thank you, Donald.
In Virginia in 2020, Joe Biden won 54% to Donald Trump's 44%, so Biden got all 13 of Virginia's Electoral College votes.
I'm sorry, did I spell that on you? Oh, don't worry about it.
While in Maine, a much smaller state, even though Biden won by a similar margin, he won 3 electoral votes and Trump took 1.
Actually, make that 3 sugars.
To win the presidency, you need to get a majority among those 538 electors. So it's 270 to win. But the winner of the national popular vote does not always win the Electoral College.
What?
In 2016, Hillary Clinton won almost 3 million more votes than Donald Trump overall, running up big victory margins in states like California, but she lost in the Electoral College, where it counts.
Over here!
In the weeks leading up to this November's election, parties in each state will nominate their slate of would-be electors, and around a month after Election Day, they'll meet to vote for the winner of their state's popular vote. There's then a complicated process of certification and notification of Congress about who the winner is. It's usually automatic and uncontroversial, although in 2020 that changed when President Trump lost, then falsely claimed victory, and supporters in several key states created slates of fake electors to the Electoral College. Trump then pressured members of Congress to overturn Biden's win by recognising the fake electors. Things got very messy, culminating in Trump supporters storming the Capitol building on January 6th to try and stop the recognition of the legitimate result. Threatening to hang Trump's vice president, Mike Pence, whose job it was to oversee the correct result. In the end, of course, Congress recognised Biden's rightful win. But the process around the Electoral College and American democracy itself almost buckled under the strain. And special thanks to our editor Gina Thompson for her animation throughout that piece. We're going to be putting that segment up on ABC Online platform so you can share it with anyone who you think might want to understand how this whole process works.
Are you voting Democrat this year? Dr. Trump says you may require a head examination. Seniors!
If any senior doesn't vote for Trump, we're going to have to send you to a psychiatrist to have your head examined.
Jews!
If you're Jewish and you vote for the Democrats, you should have your head examined.
Catholics!
There's something Trump posted on his Truth Social account. Any Catholic that votes for Comrade Kamala Harris should have their head examined.
Jews again!
Any Jewish person that votes for her or a Democrat has to go out and have their head examined.
Jews who love Israel.
Anybody that votes for them, if you're Jewish or if you love Israel, you have to have your head examined.
And finally, Jews who love being Jewish.
Anybody who's Jewish and loves being Jewish, you should have your head examined.
Don't risk it. Get your head examined today by Dr. Trump. Dr. Trump is not a real doctor.
And that's all the time we have for another Fireside Chat. Do join us for Planet America on Wednesday night, 9:30 p.m. on ABC TV, and anytime you like from 9 on iView and YouTube.
And we're going to have another Fireside Chat at the same time next week. And for even more American politics, catch the Pet Podcast and all the best hot places. See you.
Bye-bye.